Hey guys, this is AP World History, Chapter 13, The Expansive Realm of Islam. Alright, so this chapter is not necessarily about the beliefs of the religion, but rather how the religion got started and how it affected the surrounding areas. So let's go ahead and get started with Muhammad himself. And it's going to start in the Arabian Peninsula with Muhammad. Just a quick background on him. So he does have a difficult life early on. Both his parents die at an early age. He will later come across Khadijah, who will be his wife. She's a widow, and she's older than him. They'll marry. So after that, around his 40s, he will experience a spiritual transformation, and he'll say that the angel Gabriel came down to him and gave revelations to him from God. So pretty much that the angel Gabriel is telling him about God and giving him God's word. And so in the beginning, he was kind of sharing this with other people, and then he felt that he had to share it with people who were closer to him. And before anything was written down, all of this, transmission of these revelations was done orally, was done just by word of mouth. It wasn't until later where he has his followers and they begin to write the Quran. And the Quran is the holy book of Islam, and it means resuscitation, to recite. So it makes sense if he's telling his followers, the words, he's reciting it to them and they're writing it down. And like I said, it's the written account of Muhammad's revelations, and it is the Islamic religious doctrine, and it will also form other social organizations based on the Quran. In addition to that, you also had with the Quran, the creation of the Quran, the development of the Hadith, and these are saying and accounts of the Prophet. So the Quran is considered the direct recitation, like the direct sayings, this is what God told him, and the Hadith are sayings of Muhammad. So you need to make sure you know the difference between the two. All right, so your first discussion question, how do you think Muhammad's difficult childhood affected his revelation of the Quran? Meaning that did him having this hard childhood, him losing his parents at such a young age, did it affect what he said or what he was told and how he recited it to other people? So Muhammad's migration to Medina, many did not like Muhammad's teaching. So when he began to teach about the Quran, it was very different because he was saying that there's only this one God, Allah. And this was going against idolatry because where he lived in the time during the Arabian Peninsula, people believed in many gods. There was polytheistic, and the polytheism helped to make connections with merchants that were coming in and out of the area. So a lot of people saw it as this economic threat because one, it's going to denounce greed, and two, if you only believe in one God, that means that all those other deities that are out there that people are believing in, they're not going to profit from the shrines, because usually people would go and they would give tribute to their deities and give them money and honor them and stuff like that. One of the main ones that they did do that to was the Kaaba, which was a cube-shaped shrine. And so in the beginning, the Kaaba will be specifically for kind of polytheistic purposes, but later on it will turn into kind of the holy shrine of Islam. So because a lot of people didn't agree with his teachings, Muhammad was persecuted and it forced him to leave. And this migration away from his land was known as the Hijra, or migration. And it happens because of this intense persecution. Here's everybody believing in many gods, and here's Muhammad saying, no, there's only one God. So they'll leave to Medina, they'll make it to Medina, and this migration usually marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. So the way Christians have a beginning of their calendar, this marks their beginning of the Islamic calendar. So while over there in Medina, he saw that he had a lot of followers, and this was called the Ummah, the community of the faithful. And he felt that, well, now that we have this Ummah, we need to develop these legal social codes. Like, how are we going to behave when we're around each other? So he created codes for prayer, for battle, and for commercial venture. So all these things were created. So pretty much you need to start understanding that Islam isn't just a faith that, hey, we're going to go practice it at a certain time. This is something they're living day in and day out. So while Muhammad was in Medina with his ummah, with his community, he claimed himself as the seal of the prophet, which pretty much meant that he said, I am the final prophet, and that Allah would communicate through him. So important to note that he accepted all the major monotheistic religions. He said, yes, Judaism, yes, it's true. Christianity, yes, it's true. But me and Islam, this is it. We are the final and the most comprehensive account that God has given us. So, with this in mind, I'm also going to add in that Islam recognizes all the other prophets that you see in Judaism and Christianity. They recognize Abraham, they recognize Moses, they even recognize Jesus as a prophet. The difference comes is in that they do not recognize Jesus as the Savior. They just recognize him as a prophet. So make sure you understand that distinction. So this leads us to the next discussion question. Do you think Islam would be as influential as it is now if there was never any resistance to it in the beginning? So if people didn't like the religion, and they hadn't fled and kind of started their own thing, do you think it would be so popular? And 3, what are your thoughts in Muhammad claiming he was the final prophet that God would communicate through? All right, so the establishment of Islam in Arabia. So what ends up happening is that Muhammad will go back to Mecca. Okay, he'll go back to where he came from. And at first he was just there for a visit, but then he decided to conquer the city. And he pretty much forced the elite people who were there to adopt the faith, and he destroyed any shrines that were polytheistic, and he began to create mosques. And remember, mosques are these places of worship, and that's still the same word we use today. Mosque is a place of worship for Islam. He kept the Kaaba that I had mentioned earlier, that shrine that was for the polytheistic gods, but instead he made it into like kind of the Islamic holy shrine, and only those dedicated could enter, and that's still true today. You cannot go to the Kaaba unless you are Muslim. So that is still in existence. And him coming back led the first pilgrimage, and it established the Hajj. So him making his journey from Medina back to Mecca, that is known as the Hajj, and that is something that's part of the tenets of Islam that we'll get into in a bit. So the 5 pillars of Islam, these are pretty much the general rules, I guess you could say, the 5 things you're going to believe in if you're a Muslim. 1, the acknowledgement, the idea that you have to know that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is the prophet. You have to pray daily, 5 times daily, facing Mecca, which is in the east. You also have to fast during Ramadan, and the month of Ramadan varies based on the calendar. You have to give alms, meaning that you have to give to the poor, you have to give to charities. And then the Hajj. And if you can, you have to make that trip to Mecca. Mecca is their holy city, and go to the Kaaba. And that's only if you can. So these are kind of the 5 pillars that were created for Islam. It also talks about jihad, or the struggle, and many of you may have heard of this in the news. And you need to know that there are several perspectives of this. It's not, they're trying to attack Christians or anything like that. It's nothing like that. It means struggle, and it can mean various kinds of struggles. For some Muslims, it's a spiritual and moral struggle, that they're always fighting between, good and bad, and trying to do the good things in their life. For others, it's a struggle of ignorance and unbelief that, they're trying to make people see, hey, look at our faith, look at our religion. It's not terrible, all right? And trying to spread the word to convert. For others, it is a physical struggle, you know, and it does mean war for them. So, like I said, there's just several perspectives of it. And, the one you see more is that struggle of war, and it's not necessarily taken in the right context when it happens. The other thing that it talks about is the Sharia. So you need to know this. This is the holy law. This is what determines proper behavior. All right. So this is in existence to this day. If you go to Iran, they have Sharia law, meaning that every law that they create in their country is based off of Sharia law. So it's all aspects of life, and Islam developed into a way of life. Like I said, this isn't something that, hey, I'm going to go on Sunday and go to church or go to the mosque. No, this is something they practice every day. It's embedded into their daily lives. So, your next discussion question: what would you compare the 5 pillars of Islam to in Christianity, and why? And number 5, why do you think that some Muslims take the idea of jihad to an extremist level? All right, so now we're going to look at the expansion of Islam with the early caliphs and the Umayyad dynasty. Like I said, Islam wasn't just a religion, it was a way of life, and they embedded it into their dynasties. So Muhammad will obviously die, and the question is, who is going to be the next successor? Who is going to succeed him? And he already said he's the final prophet, so there cannot be another prophet, but there can be a caliph, which is kind of like a deputy or a substitute for him. So Abu Bakr, he's a close friend of Muhammad, and he will be considered the lieutenant or the substitute, the next caliph for the Islamic Empire. And he will be considered a chief judge and a religious leader and a military commander. So all those things are his roles that he has to play. In terms of expansion of Islam, we see in 633 to 637 that Islamic forces, they're going to seize the Byzantine, Syrian, Palestine, and Mesopotamia. They'll take over those areas, and then later on they'll move into Northwest Africa, Iberian Peninsula. And because they are spreading so quickly and so fast, they're going to have a difficulty in choosing how they're going to govern, essentially. And this will create a split within the Islamic community, essentially, and it's going to create 2 different sects of Islam. So one of the ones is the Shia. That's one sect, and essentially it recognizes the line of Ali, and Ali was a cousin of Muhammad and the son-in-law of Muhammad. It's going to recognize him as the caliph for a time, but people who didn't agree with that are going to assassinate him, and these followers will be recognized as the Shia. And the Shia will have their own interpretation of the Quran. They will have rituals that are different from the Sunnis. They'll have their own holy days. They'll also have, they'll also say that since they came from Ali, since Ali is recognized as, the descendant, the true person who should have been in line after Muhammad dies, they'll say that they're sinless, they're infallible, and divinely appointed. Okay? So the Sunni, keep in mind, they're the ones who are more traditional. They're the ones that say, no, Abu Bakr, he was the leader. And then the Shia say, no, it's Ali. Ali was really the true caliph, and he came into power, and because of him, we are considered infallible, sinless, and all that stuff. Okay, so the next thing it talks about is the Umayyad dynasty, and this comes after Ali's death. And it brought stability for a time, but it showed favoritism to the Arabs. And you got to understand, like, they have conquered all these areas over here, and not everybody's going to be Muslim. And so showing favoritism to Arabs and people who were Muslim, it's going to create some tension within the dynasty. Okay, so the Dar al-Islam, this is like a super important word for you to know, because that just means essentially how far the empire expanded. So pretty much it's just talking about the land. The Islamic land is the Dar al-Islam. And under the Umayyad dynasty, the Dar al-Islam was ruled as conquerors. So they were ruling almost like with absolute power, essentially. And like I said, this is going to create conflict with people who are not Muslim. All right, people who are not Muslim, we're going to say, well, you know what? You are just a conqueror. You're not treating me fairly because I'm not Muslim. And it's going to lead to a lot of resistance. So the Umayyad decline, it will decline because, one, like I said, it alienated others because how they treated them and they showed favoritism to the Muslims. They weren't meeting the needs of the Ummah was another reason for the decline, meaning that the Ummah, who's this community, they were saying, hey, you know what, these rulers, they're not thinking about us, they're thinking about themselves, they're, living luxurious lives, and here we are needing guidance and they're not providing that for us. So these things will lead to the decline of the Umayyad dynasty. So your discussion question: who would you consider the real leader of Islam? Would you consider it Abu Bakr, or would you consider it Ali, and why? And why were the Umayyads not as successful as they could have been? What was the situation? What was the problem with them? So the next dynasty that comes after the Umayyad dynasty is the Abbasid dynasty. And when they come into power, they'll end the rebellions of the Umayyads, and it will be led by Abu al-Abbas. He will be the leader of the Abbasid dynasty. He'll say he's the descendant of Muhammad's uncle. And in 1750, he'll shatter Umayyad forces, and they'll trick those left to reconcile their differences. And they'll reconcile their differences and lead into the creation of the Abbasid dynasty. And the thing with the Abbasid dynasty is that they were much more open than the Umayyads, okay? They didn't just think about themselves, they allied with Shia and non-Arab Muslims as well. And this was really going to help to create stability in their land. Also, the Abbasid dynasty is more cosmopolitan, and that what that means is that you're going to see a bunch of different types of people in this area. And they didn't favor the Arab military. Again, another difference in comparison to the Umayyads when looking at the Umayyads. And another difference was that they were not a conquering dynasty, whereas the Umayyads were all about conquering and being seen as conquerors and rulers. That's not how the Abbasid dynasty wanted to be seen. And because of this acceptance and stability and kind of letting people do their thing, this is going to lead the Dar al-Islam to grow because it's going to become more cosmopolitan. More people are going to come into it. In addition to that, the stability the Abbasid dynasty brought was also through their administration. They had a government that was similar to the Persian empires and the Mesopotamian empires. All right, they had that central authority that was in Baghdad, and they had very smart officials who they left in charge. The Qadis, it talks about, these were people who were judges, and they made the decisions based on the Quran. And then you also had the ulama, who had the religious knowledge and enforced policy. And both were very influential within the administration, within the Abbasid administration. It also talks about Harun al-Rashid. This was one of the caliphs of the Abbasid dynasty, and he was very well known to give artisans and those who were poor help and assistance. So your next discussion questions: why were the Abbasids successful within their empire? And do you think government assistance is necessary to have an empire or dynasty succeed? Why or why not? Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is the economy and society of early Islamic world. A lot of, like I said, as the empire is growing, they're bringing into the empire a bunch of new crops. They're going to expand agriculture. They're going to be more urbanized. So they use the Dar al-Islam to spread a variety of crops to different regions as they're becoming larger. And the effects of that is that obviously new crops means you're going to have more variety in your diet. You're going to increase the quantity of your food. You're going to increase your food supply. And some of those crops that they use, like cotton, they're going to have industrial uses for it. So they'll be able to make textiles out of those crops. In addition, you had the agricultural experimentation, and that's going to lead to productive economic growth. So as they're experimenting with maybe different farming techniques, different crops, the use of textiles, it only means that they're going to become wealthier because they're going to have these goods to trade with others. In terms of urban growth, we're going to see that agriculture is going to lead to cities, that artisans, and you're going to have more artisans, craftsmen, and merchants because that's what you see in the cities. Paper manufacturing will become popular, and so will textiles and glassware. So I just want to show you this map right here real quick. This is the Dar al-Islam, the Islamic land. Okay, that's what that means, the Islamic land. So at the death of Muhammad, you see it's just this blue area right here. After the conquest of the first four caliphs, not only do they gain this, but they also gain this area too, this kind of lightish greenish color here. And then after the conquest of the Umayyad caliphs, they expand into the areas of Spain, Northern Africa, further out into Southwest Asia. So just keep in mind, this is the Dar al-Islam. This is how they expanded and how they were able to bring in all those crops and all those effects that would happen because of those crops. So while looking at the map, it's obviously important to note that this is going to help them in terms of trade. They have sea routes, they have land routes as well. So they're going to be doing pretty well in terms of trade, which is the next topic. So prosperity from commerce, they took advantage of the old Silk Roads. By this time, we're looking at period 3, which is 600 CE to 1450 CE. And they're going to use those old Silk Roads for commercial purposes still. In addition, they're going to use camels as beasts of burden. They realize that camels travel better in the desert. And so because of that, they're going to have caravanserais, which is essentially caravan groups that are moving from place to place. They'll develop inns and lodging and care for animals at these caravanserais. Like I said, by looking at the map, you also had maritime trade that existed, and they were able to use technology that they got from other areas in order to help them in the maritime trade, such as Latin cells, triangular cells, and the astrolabe. They were also able to use the compass from the Chinese to help them in their maritime trade. Along with trading, you had a more sophisticated development of banks. They stimulated, obviously, the commercial economy, but they also provided various services. Pretty much everything a bank does today in terms of like providing you loan, providing you credit, exchanging money, that was already happening with the Islamic lands. So there were multiple branches, loans, brokers, checks even, and exchange of currency. So very, very sophisticated banking system. And lastly, you had the organization of trade. Business organizations played active roles in joint ventures. So you had entrepreneurs getting together with other entrepreneurs to maybe do some sort of trade route. Security for entrepreneurs was also there as well. And you pooled the resources in group investment. So you saw not just one person working on their own, but obviously multiple people in order to have maybe large ventures happening. All right. So these are your discussion questions. Number 10, how did trade lead to the creation of banks, caravanserais, business organization, and technological developments? So very quickly, I just wanted to show you some of the things that you're going to see. Like these are the mosques, okay? At the very top here, these are called minarets. Super important for you to know. You'll see them on like AP World History questions. And at the top is where they'll call for prayer, usually. This is the Quran, the holy book, with the recitation of what God told Muhammad. This is the Kaaba, that holy shrine. And during Hajj, these are all people right here. And you'll go around the Kaaba and just be praying. Again, the maritime technology that existed as well. All right, so that is essentially Islam and the importance of it as well. There's about one more slide left, and that'll cover the the influence it had on other areas.